The Blue Horizon restaurant was perfect, perched on the edge of the city with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the twinkling skyline. It was the kind of place Alan would have chosen. Elegant but understated, a world apart from the hustle of everyday life. The glow of candlelight flickered across the white tablecloth, casting soft shadows on Alan's face as he looked across at me, a small smile playing on his lips. "You look beautiful tonight, Amelia," he said, his voice low and warm. I smiled back, but my response felt distant, automatic. "Thank you, Alan." The truth was, I wasn't feeling like myself. Something felt off. It wasn't just the slight headache that had been brewing since the afternoon, or the fact that my appetite seemed to have vanished the moment we sat down. No, it was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. A chill had settled over me despite the warmth of the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Alan leaned forward, his hand brushing against mine as he picked up his glass. "To us. 5 amazing years together," he said, raising his glass for a toast. "To us," I echoed, lifting my glass, but the words tasted strange in my mouth. As our glasses clinked together, the hollow sound lingered in my ears, louder than it should have been. I forced a smile, trying to push aside the sense of unease creeping into my mind. Maybe it was just the stress from work. Maybe I was tired. But then I felt it again, that prickling sensation, like eyes boring into the back of my head. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the room. The restaurant was packed with couples and small groups, everyone caught up in their own worlds. A waiter moved between the tables, balancing plates of food with practiced grace. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, Amelia. Alan's voice brought me back to the moment. I turned back to him, blinking, trying to focus. "Sorry, what were you saying?" He frowned, his eyes searching mine. "Are you feeling okay? You seem a little distracted." I wanted to tell him the truth, but I wasn't sure how to explain what I was feeling. Instead, I shook my head and forced another smile. "I'm fine. Just a little tired, that's all." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. The waiter appeared beside us, setting down our plates with a flourish. "Shrimp scampi for the lady," he announced, placing the dish in front of me. The aroma hit me immediately, rich and savory, but instead of making my mouth water, it turned my stomach. I picked up my fork, determined to enjoy the meal. Alan had gone out of his way to make this night special, and I didn't want to ruin it with my weird mood. I speared a piece of shrimp and brought it to my lips, but before I could take a bite, that feeling hit me again, stronger this time. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. My skin tingled, and my heart raced. "Amelia." Alan's voice was sharper now, concerned. He set down his fork and reached across the table to take my hand. "You're not yourself tonight. What's going on?" I opened my mouth to respond, but suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The room tilted, and I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I don't know," I managed to say, my voice shaky. "I don't feel right. Something's wrong." Alan's expression shifted from concern to alarm. He stood up quickly, moving to my side. "Amelia, you're pale. Do you need some water? Should I call someone?" I shook my head, but the tightness in my chest only worsened. My breathing became shallow, labored. Panic surged through me as I struggled to draw in air. I can't breathe," I gasped, my voice barely audible. Alan's face drained of color. "Okay, just stay calm," he said, his voice suddenly urgent. "We need help. Now." He looked around, waving at a waiter who was passing by. "Excuse me. Something's wrong with my wife. She can't breathe." The waiter's eyes widened, and within moments, a small group of staff rushed over. One of them, a young woman with wide eyes and trembling hands, knelt beside me. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Are you allergic to anything? she asked. I tried to shake my head, but I couldn't focus. My vision was blurring, and my heart was racing too fast. She's not allergic to shrimp, Alan said, his voice rising with frustration. We've eaten here before, and she's never had a problem. The restaurant had gone eerily silent. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares as I gasped for air. Alan's hand gripped mine tightly, his knuckles white. Amelia, stay with me, he urged, his voice thick with fear. Help is coming, okay. You're going to be fine. But in that moment, with the room spinning around me and my chest tightening with every shallow breath, I wasn't so sure. Something was terribly wrong. And worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Someone who knew exactly what was happening to me. The world around me was slipping away. I could barely hear the murmurs of concern from the restaurant staff or Alan's frantic voice beside me. My vision was dimming, the edges of the room growing fuzzy, but I was acutely aware of the tightening in my chest. Every breath felt like a battle I was losing. Amelia, stay with me. Alan's voice broke through the fog, a mixture of desperation and panic. He was kneeling beside me now, his hands trembling as he brushed my hair back from my face. Amelia, please, look at me. I tried to focus on him, tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was closing. I couldn't get the words out. My mind was screaming that I needed air, that I needed to get out of there, but my body wouldn't respond. A sharp pain radiated through my chest, and the world tilted again. The restaurant, the lights, the faces around me, they were all fading into a blur of color and sound. My heart pounded in my ears, deafening, drowning out everything else. I felt myself slipping, the edges of consciousness pulling away, and then everything went dark. I woke up to chaos. The first thing I was aware of was the sound, the piercing wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. My body felt heavy, too heavy, like I was sinking into the floor. My head throbbed with a dull ache, and my throat burned as though it had been scraped raw. Through the haze, I could hear Alan's voice again, closer now. She's not allergic to anything, he was saying, his tone laced with frustration and fear. She's never had a reaction like this before. What the hell is going on? Someone else spoke, their voice calm but firm. Sir, please step back. We need space to work. I blinked, trying to open my eyes fully, but the light overhead was too bright, stabbing into my skull like knives. I turned my head slightly, wincing as I tried to take in my surroundings. I was still in the restaurant, lying on the floor. The diners had all retreated to the far edges of the room, their faces pale with concern and curiosity. Amelia. Alan's voice was right beside me again, and I felt his hand on mine. Can you hear me? The paramedics are here. You're going to be okay. I tried to nod, but it felt like my body wasn't mine anymore. The dizziness still lingered, and my chest ached with every breath I took. I struggled to speak, but only a weak whisper came out. Alan. He leaned in closer, his eyes wide with relief. Amelia, thank God. You're okay. Just stay with me. Before I could say anything else, a paramedic knelt down beside me, her face calm and professional. Ma'am, I need you to stay still. We're going to get you out of here and to the hospital. Can you tell me where it hurts? I swallowed hard, fighting the burning in my throat. I can't breathe right, I managed to rasp. She nodded, her hands moving with swift precision as she attached something to my arm. You're doing great. We're going to give you oxygen and something to help with the breathing. Just try to relax. Relax. Easier said than done. My heart still felt like it was trying to escape my chest, and the room seemed to tilt every time I blinked. But the paramedic's voice was steady, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Alan hovered beside her, his face twisted in anguish. What's happening to her? Is it an allergy? The paramedic looked up at him, her expression neutral. It's possible, but we can't say for sure yet. She needs to be monitored. Her breathing is unstable, and we need to get her to the hospital immediately." Alan's jaw clenched, and he rubbed a hand across his face. "But she's not allergic to anything. This doesn't make any sense." I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that I'd be fine, but the truth was, I was terrified. Nothing about this felt normal. My body was betraying me, and I had no idea why. "Sir, we need to move quickly," the paramedic said, cutting through the tension. She gestured to the stretcher being wheeled toward me. "Let's get her loaded up." As they lifted me onto the stretcher, my head swam, and I closed my eyes, hoping to block out the spinning world. But in the brief moment of darkness, that same unsettling feeling returned, the feeling that someone was watching me. It prickled at the back of my neck, making my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just the fear, the panic. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something, or someone, was behind this. The ride to the hospital was a blur of lights and noise. Alan sat beside me in the ambulance, his hand gripping mine as if he could anchor me to reality. He kept murmuring reassurances, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. "You're going to be okay, Amelia. Just hold on a little longer," he said, squeezing my hand tightly. I wanted to believe him, but my mind kept spiraling back to that moment at the restaurant, the feeling that I was being watched. Who was it? Why would someone want to hurt me? As we sped through the city streets, I fought to stay awake, to keep my thoughts together. But just as the ambulance turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of something through the small rear window. A shadowy figure standing at the intersection, watching the ambulance pass. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't an accident. The hospital emergency room was a whirlwind of motion the moment the ambulance doors swung open. Nurses and doctors rushed to my side, their voices blending into a cacophony of medical jargon. Bright, sterile lights flickered overhead, a stark contrast to the dim coziness of the Blue Horizon restaurant where the evening had begun. I could barely comprehend the rapid-fire questions directed at me as I was wheeled through the double doors. My chest still burned with every breath, and a heavy pressure made it feel like an iron grip was clamped around my lungs. The oxygen mask over my face helped, but not nearly enough. Panic buzzed at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to consume me. Alan's hand slipped from mine as the paramedics and medical staff took over. He tried to follow, but a nurse held him back. His voice echoed down the hallway, thick with worry and frustration. "I need to be with her." Alan's shout cut through the noise, filled with raw fear. "She's never had a reaction like this. Someone needs to explain what's happening." A nurse placed a hand on his arm, her voice firm but kind. "Sir, please. We're doing everything we can. You can stay here until we know more." Alan's eyes flashed with frustration, but he stepped back, his hands running through his hair in helplessness. His gaze met mine as they wheeled me further into the ER, and I could see the torment in his face. I tried to lift a hand, tried to signal to him that I would be fine, but the weakness in my limbs prevented me. I was trapped in my own body, fighting against the tide of whatever was tearing me apart. Inside the trauma room, the doctors moved with practiced precision. IV lines were inserted, monitors were attached, and my oxygen mask was adjusted as they worked to stabilize me. Despite the flurry of activity, I felt strangely detached, like I was floating just above the scene, watching it all unfold as if it were happening to someone else. "She's tachycardic." A nurse's voice broke through my daze, pulling me back into the present. "Heart rates at 140 and climbing." "Any known allergies?" asked the attending doctor, a tall woman with sharp eyes. "No," one of the paramedics answered. "Her husband insists she has no history of allergies. He's pretty adamant about it." The doctor frowned. "This looks like an anaphylactic reaction. We've administered epinephrine, but her breathing is still compromised. We'll need to intubate if this doesn't improve soon." The word intubate hit me like a jolt of electricity. My mind raced. How could this be happening? I wasn't allergic to anything. Alan had been right. We'd eaten shrimp dozens of times before. It didn't make sense. As they continued their work, I tried to focus on the people around me, grounding myself in their voices, their movements. But in the back of my mind, the unsettling feeling that had started at the restaurant still gnawed at me. The sensation of being watched, of someone lurking just beyond my vision, hadn't gone away. If anything, it had intensified. The doctor leaned over me, her face swimming into view. "Amelia, can you hear me? I need you to stay with us. We're doing everything we can, okay?" I nodded weakly, my throat too constricted to answer. She gave me a small, reassuring smile, but I could see the concern behind her eyes. Then, just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the doors to the trauma room burst open, and a young woman rushed in. She was out of breath, her dark hair falling loose from a hastily tied bun. Her scrubs were wrinkled, as if she'd been in a hurry, but there was a determined gleam in her eyes. "I have the antidote," she said, holding up a small vial. Her voice was breathless but steady. The doctor looked up, confused. "Who are you?" "My name is Olivia," the woman replied. "I'm one of the nurses here. I'd overheard her case, and I think I know what's going on. We don't have much time. This is a rare reaction, but I've seen it before. It's not an allergy. It's a neurotoxin." "A neurotoxin," the doctor repeated, eyes narrowing. "What kind of neurotoxin?" "Administer the antidote," Olivia urged. "It's fast-acting, and it could reverse the symptoms. I don't have all the details yet, but if I'm right, this will save her life." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, tension crackling in the air as the doctor weighed her options. Finally, she nodded to the nurse standing by, who quickly took the vial from Olivia's hand and prepared it for injection. The seconds stretched out as the antidote was administered, and I could feel a strange warmth spreading through my veins. The tightness in my chest began to ease just a little, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I took a shallow, pain-free breath. Alan rushed into the room moments later, his face a mixture of fear and hope. He saw the change in me, saw the way the doctors were no longer moving with frantic urgency, and relief flooded his features. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He moved to my side, grabbing my hand. "Thank God. I thought I lost you." I squeezed his hand weakly, the warmth of his touch grounding me back to reality. "I'm still here," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as I lay there, my body slowly recovering, my mind was racing. A neurotoxin? How? Why? The questions tumbled over each other, but one thought rose above them all, chilling me to the bone. Someone had done this to me. Back in the waiting area, after I was stabilized, Alan approached Olivia, who had quietly slipped out of the trauma room. His voice was low, but the intensity was unmistakable. "How did you know?" Adeline asked. "How did you know it wasn't an allergy?" Olivia hesitated for a moment, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "I've seen this kind of poisoning before," she said quietly. "It's rare, but it happens. The symptoms mimic an allergic reaction, but it's much more dangerous. Whoever did this, they knew exactly what they were doing." Alan's face went pale. "What are you saying?" Olivia met his gaze, her expression grim. "This wasn't an accident. Someone tried to kill her." The ambulance's sirens wailed, cutting through the stillness of the night as it sped toward the hospital. Inside, I was fighting to stay conscious, but my body felt like it was shutting down. The world was a blur of flashing lights and muffled sounds. The only clear thing I could feel was the crushing weight on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. "Hang in there, Amelia." Alan's voice echoed faintly through the haze. He was seated next to me, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. His hands hovered nervously over mine, as if afraid to touch me, afraid that I might slip away with just the slightest wrong move. "Stay with me, okay? You're going to be fine. The hospital isn't far. The paramedics worked in tense silence, their hands moving rapidly as they adjusted my oxygen mask and checked the monitors. One of them spoke into his radio, calling ahead to the hospital. Patient is a 35-year-old female, experiencing acute respiratory distress, possible anaphylaxis. Vitals unstable. ETA 5 minutes. I tried to focus on Alan's face, searching for reassurance, but I could see the fear etched in every line of his expression. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that this was just a freak accident, but I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, and each breath felt like I was trying to suck air through a straw. Alan leaned closer, his voice breaking. Amelia, I don't understand. How could this happen? You've never been allergic to shrimp. It doesn't make sense. His eyes searched mine, desperate for answers, but I had none to give. I could barely think, let alone make sense of what was happening to me. All I knew was that something was horribly, terribly wrong, and the fear in his voice only made it worse. One of the paramedics glanced at Alan, his voice steady but urgent. We're doing everything we can, but her condition is deteriorating quickly. It might be something more serious than an allergic reaction. We need to get her to the hospital now. Alan's grip tightened on the edge of the stretcher. Something more serious? Like what? The paramedic didn't answer, his focus shifting back to me as he prepared a syringe, injecting something into my IV. The ambulance bounced as it hit a pothole, and I winced, the sudden jolt sending a wave of pain through my chest. I could feel the pressure mounting, like my body was closing in on itself. The lights inside the ambulance flickered slightly, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur together. My vision dimmed, and the sounds around me faded into an indistinct hum. No. Stay awake. Stay awake. I fought to stay present, clinging to the sound of Alan's voice. But I could feel my body betraying me, slipping further and further into the darkness that threatened to pull me under. Suddenly, a sharp jolt of clarity pierced through the fog. I gasped, feeling a strange warmth flooding my body. My vision sharpened, and I could feel the tightness in my chest begin to ease, just slightly. It wasn't enough to make me feel safe, but it was something. The paramedic who had administered the shot leaned in, checking my vitals again. She's stabilizing, but we're not out of the woods yet. Let's move. As the ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the hospital, the paramedics flung the doors open and wheeled me out. Alan hurried beside me, his face a mixture of hope and dread. Doctors and nurses swarmed us the moment we entered the emergency room, their voices overlapping in a frenzy of action. Alan was immediately stopped by a nurse who held out her hands to block his way. "Sir, you need to stay here," she said firmly. "We'll take care of her from here." Alan's eyes darted back and forth between the nurse and me as they rushed me through the sliding doors. "Please just tell me she'll be okay," he begged, his voice cracking. "We're doing everything we can," the nurse said, her tone softer this time. "But you need to let us work." Alan stood there helplessly as they wheeled me away, the distance between us growing wider with every second. His shoulders slumped, his face pale and stricken. He watched as the team of doctors disappeared with me into the trauma unit, leaving him standing in the brightly lit corridor, alone. Once inside the trauma room, the air buzzed with controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses moved swiftly, their hands a blur as they worked to assess my condition. I felt the needle of another IV puncture my skin, the sharp sting barely registering through the haze that clouded my mind. One of the doctors, a tall man with glasses and a calm but focused demeanor, leaned over me, shining a light into my eyes. "Amelia, can you hear me? I need you to stay with us, okay?" I nodded weakly, my limbs feeling heavy and distant, as though they weren't my own. The pressure in my chest had lessened, but I still felt as though I were teetering on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall at any moment. The doctor looked up at one of the nurses. "Her oxygen levels are still low. We need to intubate if she doesn't respond in the next few minutes." My mind whirled at the thought of being intubated, but I didn't have the strength to react. All I could do was lie there, my body limp and uncooperative as they worked around me. The medical jargon filled the room, but it all sounded like white noise. Then, just as they prepared for the worst, I heard a voice, a familiar one. Wait. The doors to the trauma room flew open, and Olivia, the same nurse who had entered the hospital with the antidote, rushed in. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with urgency. I have it, the antidote. This will save her. The doctors looked at her in confusion. What do you mean, antidote? One of them asked. What are you talking about? Olivia held up a vial, her voice firm. This isn't an allergic reaction. It's poisoning, a neurotoxin. I've seen it before. We don't have time to argue. If we don't administer this now, she won't make it. The room fell silent for a heartbeat as the doctor in charge glanced at the vial, then back at Olivia. The tension was palpable. Finally, with a curt nod, he motioned for the nurse to take the vial from Olivia. Do it. Within moments, the antidote was injected into my IV. The effect was almost immediate. A rush of warmth spread through my body, and I could feel the tightness in my chest start to release, my breathing gradually becoming more regular. Alan, who had been pacing just outside the room, burst in as soon as he saw the change in me. His face was a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief as he rushed to my side, grabbing my hand. Amelia, he whispered, his voice trembling. Thank God. I thought I lost you. I squeezed his hand weakly, feeling the life slowly returning to my body. But even as I lay there, the fear didn't completely subside. There were still so many unanswered questions about what had happened and who had done this to me. As I lay there, recovering, I couldn't shake the sense that something far more sinister had just begun. The chaos of the hospital had died down, but the air still buzzed with an uneasy tension. I lay in the recovery room, my body weak, but no longer battling for every breath. Alan hadn't left my side since they'd stabilized me, his hand clutching mine like he was afraid I might slip away again. But my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying the moments leading up to the collapse over and over in my head. The sensation of being watched, the sudden onset of illness. None of it made sense, until Olivia had burst into the trauma room with that vial of antidote. The memory of her voice, so certain, so urgent, echoed in my ears. Poison. I turned my head slightly to glance at Alan, who sat in the chair next to me, staring into the distance. His face was lined with worry, dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept, hadn't even eaten. Not that I'd seen. His concern felt genuine, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. My mind was racing with unanswered questions. The door creaked open, and Olivia stepped in, a clipboard in her hand. Her face was calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a readiness for something that hadn't yet been said. She looked at me, then at Alan, before taking a seat on the other side of the bed. Amelia, how are you feeling? Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. A tension, a seriousness that seemed heavier than the situation already was. Better, I croaked, my voice still hoarse from the ordeal. Thanks to you. Alan glanced at Olivia, confusion flickering across his face. Yeah, thank you. I don't think I fully understand what happened back there. His voice was shaky, filled with both gratitude and a desperate need for answers. What was that antidote? How did you know what to do? Olivia met his gaze, her expression carefully controlled. I've seen cases like this before. Symptoms like Amelia's aren't caused by an allergic reaction. They're caused by a neurotoxin. Alan's face went pale. A neurotoxin? He echoed, disbelief lacing his words. But that's impossible. How? It's not impossible. Olivia cut in, her tone firm. Amelia didn't have an allergic reaction to the shrimp. Someone poisoned her. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I felt Alan stiffen next to me, his grip on my hand loosening as he processed what Olivia had just said. Poisoned. The very thought seemed absurd, like something out of a crime novel. But the reality of it hit hard. Someone had wanted me dead. Poisoned. I whispered, the word foreign on my tongue. But who? Why? Olivia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. That's what we need to figure out. This isn't something random. Whoever did this to you knew what they were doing. The toxin I recognized is not easily obtained. It's the kind of thing used in very deliberate attacks. Alan shook his head, his voice trembling. But why would anyone want to harm Amelia? We were just celebrating our anniversary. We don't have enemies. Olivia glanced between the two of us, her expression hard to read. Do you? Is there anyone? Anyone at all? Who might have a reason to want to hurt either of you? Alan opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His hand fell away from mine, and he stood up abruptly, pacing the small hospital room. No, there's no one, he said, his voice rising. Amelia has never hurt anyone. We live quiet lives. How could this happen to us? I watched him, my mind churning. Alan's reaction felt sincere. He looked genuinely distraught. But there was something I couldn't shake. Why had Olivia come to the hospital with that antidote? How had she known what was happening before the doctors even figured it out? Olivia. I started, my voice still weak but firmer now. How did you know? How did you get the antidote so fast? She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed, leaning back in her chair. I've worked in trauma units before. I've seen cases like this in other hospitals. A few years ago, there was a similar incident involving this same toxin. It's rare, but it's out there. When I heard the symptoms being described, I had a hunch. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was piecing something together herself. I wasn't supposed to be at the restaurant tonight, she continued. I was covering for a friend. Something just didn't feel right, so when I saw you collapse, I acted on instinct. Ellen stopped pacing, turning to face Olivia. Wait, so you weren't even supposed to be working tonight? She nodded. No, but I'm glad I was. I swallowed hard, a chill running through me. What were the chances? Olivia, of all people, had been in the right place at the right time, with knowledge that had saved my life. But now the question wasn't just about how I'd been poisoned. It was about why. Do you think it was someone at the restaurant? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Could it have been the food? The drinks? Olivia hesitated. It's possible, but I'm not sure. We'll need to look into it. The toxin could have been introduced in any number of ways, and whoever did this would have had to plan it carefully. The fact that you felt like you were being watched before it happened suggests this wasn't random. Alan's face darkened, so someone was targeting her. Olivia's expression grew grim. Yes, and we need to find out who. Silence filled the room, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. Alan finally sank back into the chair next to me, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. He looked lost, like the foundation of his world had just been ripped out from under him. I closed my eyes, feeling exhaustion creep over me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Someone had tried to take my life, and they were still out there. But with Olivia's help, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. As I drifted into a restless sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. Who wanted me dead? And why? The hospital lights were dim, casting a soft glow over the sterile white walls. I had been moved to a private room, but the tension in the air was thick. Alan sat beside me, quiet and brooding, while Olivia stood near the window, her arms crossed, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I had been released from the grip of the toxin, but not from the cloud of doubt that now hung over me. Every moment, every thought brought a new question, a new suspicion. Who had poisoned me, and why? The more I tried to think about it, the more confused I became. Alan had been quiet ever since Olivia's revelation about the poison, and something about his silence unnerved me. He wasn't acting like himself. He was distant, almost like he was avoiding something, or hiding something. I still can't believe this, Alan muttered, breaking the silence. He rubbed his hands over his face. Someone poisoned you, Amelia. What kind of sick person would do something like that? I don't know, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have the energy to argue, to speculate. My body was healing, but my mind was in turmoil. Olivia turned away from the window, her gaze landing on me. Amelia, do you remember anything else from that night? Anything unusual? A face, a conversation, anything at all that might give us a clue? I shook my head, trying to dig through the haze of that evening. No, I just remember feeling off. Like someone was watching me. And then, nothing. Alan leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair tightly. What about the food? Do you think it could have been something in the shrimp? It wasn't the shrimp, Olivia cut in, her voice firm. I've already talked to the doctors, and they ruled out any allergic reaction. This was deliberate, Alan. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Alan frowned, his brow furrowing deeper. But who? Why would anyone do this to Amelia? She's never hurt anyone. Olivia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied me closely, as if trying to read my thoughts. Then she took a deep breath, her expression softening. I don't think it's about hurting Amelia, she said quietly. It might be about hurting you. The room went still. Alan's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. What? Me? That's ridiculous. Is it? Olivia asked, crossing her arms. You and Amelia are high profile in the business world. You've made some enemies, Alan. Powerful ones. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to send a message by going after a loved one. I watched Alan's face, searching for a reaction. He looked stunned, but then a shadow passed over his features, something darker, something defensive. I don't have enemies like that, Alan said quickly, too quickly. And even if I did, poisoning Amelia, that's insane. Olivia's gaze didn't waver. Is it? Alan stood up abruptly, his movements sharp. You don't know what you're talking about, Olivia. You're just speculating. I'm not just speculating, she countered, her tone remaining calm but insistent. I know what I saw, and I know how these things work. I've seen it before. I could feel the tension between them growing, and it only added to my confusion. Alan was acting strange, and Olivia seemed to be probing him for something. I wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Alan, I said softly, drawing his attention back to me. Is there something you're not telling me? His face softened as he looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. But there was something else there, too, a flicker of hesitation. No, Amelia, he said, his voice low. I promised you I would never hide anything from you. I don't know why this happened, but we'll figure it out. Together. He took my hand, squeezing it gently, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Alan wasn't being completely honest with me, and that realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Olivia, sensing the shift in the room, cleared her throat. Look, she said, we need to dig deeper. I'm going to start by looking into the restaurant staff, see if anyone there has any connections or motives. But we can't rule out the possibility that this is personal. Personal? I asked, my voice shaky. You think someone close to me did this? Olivia's eyes softened. I don't want to believe that either, Amelia, but we have to explore every possibility. You said you felt like you were being watched, right? That could mean someone was following you, or it could mean someone you know was already there, waiting for the right moment. Alan shook his head, his frustration mounting. This is absurd. We don't have enemies. Not like that. Maybe not, Olivia said, her gaze never leaving his. But someone out there wanted Amelia dead. and until we figure out who that is, no theory is off the table." There was a long, heavy silence after her words. Alan turned away, his back to us, his shoulders tense. I felt a sinking feeling in my chest. Something about all of this didn't add up. As Olivia gathered her things and prepared to leave, she paused by the door and glanced back at me. "Amelia, if you remember anything at all, call me. And don't worry. We'll get to the bottom of this." After she left, the room felt colder, emptier. Alan remained by the window, staring out into the night, lost in thought. I watched him for a long moment before speaking. "Alan, are you sure there's nothing you're not telling me?" He didn't turn around. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me, but then his voice came, soft and strained. "Amelia, I swear, I don't know who did this. But I promise, I'll protect you. No matter what." His words sounded sincere, but that flicker of doubt refused to leave me. I didn't know who to trust anymore, not even the man I had loved for years. And as the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only scratching the surface of something far darker than I could imagine. The tension between Alan and me had been growing ever since Olivia's suspicions were raised. Every conversation felt laced with an undercurrent of doubt, and even though I tried to believe Alan, there was something in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't settle. Olivia had promised to investigate the restaurant staff, but I could tell she had her doubts about Alan too. It had been a few days since I was discharged from the hospital, but I hadn't yet returned to work. My body was healing, but my mind was far from at ease. Olivia had been keeping me updated on her findings, though there wasn't much progress. At least, not until that afternoon. I was sitting in our living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when I heard a knock at the door. Alan had left for work earlier, so I was expecting a delivery. But when I opened the door, I found Olivia standing there, her expression more serious than I had ever seen. "Olivia," I said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice tight. I nodded and stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the living room and stood by the window, looking out as if trying to find the right words. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my heart starting to race. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with concern. "Amelia, I found something. Something you need to see." My throat tightened. "What is it?" She pulled out a small envelope from her bag and handed it to me. I could feel my hands shaking as I opened it. Inside was a set of photographs, grainy, but clear enough to make my heart stop. They were of Alan. At first, it looked innocent. Him standing outside our house, him at work, him at the hospital. But then, the next set of photos hit me like a punch to the gut. They showed him meeting with someone I didn't recognize in a dimly lit parking lot. The man handed Alan a small vial, and Alan pocketed it. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I've been digging into the restaurant staff like I said I would," Olivia explained, her voice calm but firm. "But nothing was coming up, so I started looking into Alan's recent movements. I hired someone to follow him, and this is what they found." I stared at the photos, my mind reeling. You think Alan had something to do with this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Olivia's expression softened. "Amelia, I don't want to believe it either. But the evidence is there. That vial, it matches the type of poison used on you." I stumbled back, sinking onto the couch. My world felt like it was spinning out of control. I couldn't breathe. The man I loved, the man who had been by my side through all of this, could he really have done this to me? "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "It can't be true. Alan would never." "Amelia," Olivia said softly, sitting down beside me, "I know this is hard to hear, but we have to be realistic. Alan's been acting strange ever since that night. He's been avoiding questions, and now this. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I buried my face in my hands. But why? Why would he do this? I don't know, Olivia admitted, but we're going to find out. Just as she said that, the front door opened, and Alan walked in. His eyes immediately went to the two of us, and he frowned. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone sharp. I looked up at him, the tears still fresh in my eyes. "Alan, what is this?" I held up the photos, my hand trembling. His face went pale. He didn't move for a long moment, and then he took a step back, shaking his head. "Amelia, it's not what it looks like." "Then what is it?" Olivia shot back, standing between us. "Because it looks like you've been hiding something from her, something dangerous." "I can explain," Alan said, his voice tense. "But not like this. Please, Amelia, let me explain." I stood up, the pain and confusion swirling inside me. "Then explain," I cried. "Why are you meeting with someone in a dark parking lot? Why do you have a vial of the same poison that nearly killed me? How could you? How could you do this?" "I didn't do it," Alan shouted, his voice desperate. "I didn't poison you, Amelia. I would never hurt you." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "Then what were you doing with that man? And why didn't you tell anyone about this? You've been hiding things, Alan." Alan's face twisted with frustration, his hands gripping his hair as he paced the room. "I wasn't hiding it because I hurt her. I was trying to protect her." "Protect me," I echoed, disbelief filling my voice. "By lying to me." He stopped, turning to face me, his eyes filled with pain. "Amelia, I got a tip. Someone told me you were being targeted, that you were in danger. I didn't know if it was true or not, but I couldn't risk it. That man, I met with him because he claimed he had information. I didn't trust him, but I was desperate." Olivia folded her arms, still skeptical. "And the vial?" Alan's gaze flickered toward the photos. "It's an antidote. Or at least, that's what he said it was. I didn't know if I could trust him. But if something happened to you, I needed to have something, just in case." I could hear the sincerity in his voice, but I couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching feeling of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me, Alan?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" He took a step toward me, his eyes pleading. "I didn't want to scare you. I thought I could handle it on my own. I was trying to protect you, Amelia, I swear." Olivia wasn't convinced. "You had this information, and instead of going to the police, you handled it on your own. That sounds like a pretty dangerous gamble, Alan." Alan's face hardened. "I didn't want to put her in more danger. I thought I could fix it without dragging anyone else into it. I didn't know what to believe anymore. My heart wanted to believe Alan, to trust that he was telling the truth, but the doubts wouldn't leave me. The betrayal I felt was too deep. "I need time," I whispered, stepping away from him. "Amelia, please," Alan said, his voice filled with anguish. "I love you. I was only trying to keep you safe." But the cracks in our relationship had grown too wide. I couldn't bridge the gap between us right now. Not with everything I had seen. "Just go, Alan," I whispered, unable to look him in the eye. "Please." He hesitated for a long moment, then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me with a broken heart and a sea of unanswered questions. I collapsed back onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. Olivia stayed by my side, her hand on my shoulder, offering silent support. But even with her there, the overwhelming sense of betrayal consumed me. Had I lost the man I loved forever? Or had I ever truly known him at all? The weeks following Alan's departure were some of the hardest of my life. I had once imagined this time as part of our anniversary celebration, full of joy and love, looking ahead to a future together. Instead, I was left to grapple with a fractured heart and the knowledge that the man I had trusted had been keeping dangerous secrets. Olivia had stayed by my side through it all, proving herself not only as a friend, but as someone I could rely on when everything else seemed to fall apart. She continued to dig into the mystery behind my poisoning, while I tried to rebuild the pieces of my life. It wasn't easy. My trust in people had been shattered, but with each passing day, I found a new strength within myself. A strength I never knew I had. And with that strength came a realization. I could no longer let fear or betrayal define me. If anything, this experience had shown me how vulnerable so many women were to those they thought they could trust. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Olivia joined me. She had been unusually quiet that day, and I could sense there was something on her mind. "You're lost in thought," she said, breaking the silence as she sat down beside me. I smiled weakly. "Just thinking about everything. How much has changed? How much I've changed." Olivia nodded, her gaze softening. "You've been through hell, Amelia. But look at you, you're still standing. You've always been stronger than you realize." "Thanks to you," I replied, my voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "Actually," Olivia said, her tone growing serious, "I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to run it by you." I turned to her, curious. "What is it?" "You know how we talked about what happened to you, how vulnerable you felt, how alone, and how many other women are going through similar situations, whether they realize it or not?" She began, her eyes intent on mine. "Yeah," I nodded. The feeling of powerlessness, of having my life almost stolen from me, was something I knew many others must have experienced. "Well," Olivia continued, "what if we did something about it? What if we created a place, a safe haven, for women in danger? Somewhere they can go when they feel threatened, where they can get legal support, counseling, and protection." The idea hit me like a bolt of lightning. "You mean an organization?" "Yes," Olivia said, excitement creeping into her voice. "A nonprofit. We could call it Safe Haven. We focus on providing resources for women at risk of domestic violence, emotional abuse, or any kind of threat to their well-being. We could help them before it's too late." My heart raced at the thought. It was a chance to turn my pain into purpose, to make something good come out of everything that had happened. "Olivia, that's brilliant." "You think so?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. "I do," I replied, feeling a spark of hope ignite within me. "I've been trying to figure out how to move forward from all of this, how to make sense of it. And this could be it. We could make a real difference." Olivia smiled. "I knew you'd feel the same way. We've both seen how bad things can get when women don't have a place to turn. But now, we could give them that place." The two of us spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, sharing our visions of what Safe Haven could become. We discussed potential partnerships with lawyers, therapists, and shelters. We talked about outreach programs and workshops that would educate women about their rights and the resources available to them. Every word felt like a step toward healing, a way to take back control over my life, and help others do the same. As the conversation continued, I couldn't help but think about Alan. I hadn't seen him since that day he walked out, but his absence still weighed on me. Part of me wanted to reach out to him, to understand what had truly happened between us. But I also knew I needed to focus on moving forward. As if reading my thoughts, Olivia looked at me with a gentle expression. "You've come so far, Amelia. Don't look back now." I nodded, blinking back the tears that had gathered in my eyes. "I know, but it's hard." "It is," Olivia agreed. "But you've survived this. And now, you're about to turn your pain into something that could change lives. That's what matters now." I took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. She was right. Alan's betrayal was a wound that would take time to heal, but it didn't define me. What defined me was what I chose to do next, and that was to help others who might be walking the same path I had been forced down. A few weeks later, we officially launched Safe Haven. It started small, with just a few volunteers and a rented office space. But the response was overwhelming. Women began reaching out to us almost immediately, seeking advice, shelter, and hope. With every story we heard, with every woman we helped, I felt more certain that this was the path I was meant to take. One afternoon, as we were preparing for a support group session, Olivia turned to me with a smile. "You know, I always knew you were strong. But this is something else, Amelia. You're doing something amazing." I smiled back at her, my heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Olivia. You saved me, literally and figuratively." "We saved each other," she replied, her voice warm. As I looked around the bustling office, filled with women who were finally finding their voices, I felt a deep sense of peace. I had come through the darkest time of my life, but now I was standing in the light. And I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. We all were. In that moment, I knew that Safe Haven wasn't just a new beginning for me, but for countless women who needed a second chance. And that, more than anything, gave me hope for the future.